Life is gonna take me on. But I can promise you all this. I got one question for the graduating class of 1996.
He voted most likely to succeed.
Like 3 to 6 inches bigger.
Ethan got promoted.
Hey, no, you play your chessboard however you like. Don't get hyphy. We gonna get hyphy. Right?
I know this kind of sucks.
No. Anything else, please?
Oh, it's tomorrow night.
Oh. That's all.
Okay, I see.
Wait a minute, didn't you get voted most likely to succeed? Firm. Okay, instead, I work in a building with a giant inflated life. Down here became a disappointment.
Your life with me was such a soundless crash.
I'm not going. Okay.
Some movies make you feel before they explain anything, before the plot kicks in, before the characters are properly introduced, before the genre even reveals itself. Central Intelligence is one of those movies, and it pulls that off in the first 5 minutes with a scene that is equal parts funny, wincing, and quietly devastating. That opening scene is doing a lot of heavy lifting, more than most people realize on a first watch. So let's start right there. 1996. The gym is packed. Rows and rows of high school seniors crammed into wooden bleachers, that specific nervous energy of a year-end assembly hanging in the air. Banners, teachers along the walls looking vaguely proud, the particular atmosphere of an event where something is supposed to feel important and mostly does. And then Calvin Joyner steps up. The crowd goes absolutely electric, not in a polite golf clap kind of way. These kids adore this person. Calvin Joyner, Kevin Hart, at his most natural and loose, is the kind of high school student that everyone, regardless of their social tier, just likes. He's funny without being cruel, charming without being slick, warm in a way that doesn't feel calculated. When he reaches that podium and launches into his speech, the room is with him completely. He's named most likely to succeed. Of course he is. Hart plays this with real restraint. There's no smugness to Calvin here, no mean girl superiority beneath the popularity. He's just genuinely, infectiously great, and the movie needs you to believe that. The whole emotional engine of everything that follows depends on you understanding who Calvin Joyner was at 17, because who he became is going to hurt a little. But we'll get to that. The assembly is humming along. Calvin is wrapping up, riding that wave of collective affection, when the gym doors bang open on the far side of the room. Before you see anything, you hear it. Shouting, laughter, the particular chaos energy of a group of teenage boys who have decided to cause damage. And then Robbie Weirdicht enters the gym, not by choice. Trevor Olson, Jason Bateman, perfectly cast as the kind of person who smiles while he hurts you, and his circle of friends had found Robbie alone in the shower. They grabbed him, And now they've launched this kid, this heavy, vulnerable, completely exposed kid, straight into the middle of the packed gymnasium. No warning, no escape. Just, here he is, in front of everyone. The whole room turns. Robbie's face is everything. That specific horror of having nowhere to go, no way to make this smaller, no version of the next 30 seconds that ends with dignity. He's frozen for a moment in the sheer assault of being looked at by hundreds of people all at once, all of them laughing, and they do laugh. The room erupts, loud, thoughtless, that specific group cruelty that requires no individual to feel particularly responsible because everyone else is doing it. That diffusion of guilt across a crowd is one of the ugliest things high school produces. Nobody steps up, nobody says stop, the laughter just rolls. Except one person. Calvin Joyner doesn't laugh. His face moves through recognition to discomfort to something else. Not pity, exactly, more like a clarity about what's actually happening in front of him. And without a speech, without moral grandstanding, without making it a whole thing, he just takes off his varsity jacket and throws it across to Robbie. That's it. That's the whole gesture. A jacket. Robbie clutches it, covers himself, and runs. Here's what I love about how that moment is shot. Thurber doesn't linger on it. The movie doesn't swell with music or close in on Calvin's face for a meaningful reaction beat. It just lets the action happen at natural speed and trusts the audience to feel its weight without being told what to feel. Because the weight is there, obviously. Think about what that jacket represents in the social calculus of high school. It's not just fabric, it's the physical marker of everything Calvin is. Star athlete, most popular kid, man of the moment. Handing it to the most humiliated person in the room, in public, with everyone watching, that's a risk, even if a small one. It could have read as mockery. It could have turned the room on Calvin. At very least, it's a declaration. I am not laughing at this person. I see what's happening and I'm not okay with it. In 30 seconds, without a single word. And then the assembly continues. Calvin goes back to being Calvin. The teachers smile. The crowd applauds. Robbie disappears from the frame, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, and the movie moves on like nothing seismic just happened. But something seismic did happen. Robbie Weirdicht carries that jacket for 20 years. Not literally, though the movie does bring it back, physically, in the final scene, and when it reappears, you'll feel the full weight of it. But emotionally, metaphorically, that jacket is what Robbie has. In the absolute worst public moment of his teenage life, when Trevor Olson and everyone else chose cruelty, one person chose something different. Calvin Joyner chose something different. That is the entire relationship. That is the emotional architecture the rest of the film is built on. Not a deep childhood friendship, not years of shared history. One moment, one gesture, one decision to be decent when being decent was unnecessary and slightly inconvenient. The movie asks, what does that mean to someone who had nothing else? And then it builds an action comedy spy thriller around the answer, which is honestly kind of audacious and kind of brilliant. There's something worth saying about Trevor Olson here too, because Jason Bateman doesn't show up in the movie just once. He comes back, and the second time he's on screen, the years haven't changed him much, not in the ways that matter. That specific kind of cruelty, the casual entitlement of someone who never faced consequences for the harm they caused, tends to calcify. It doesn't grow up. It just gets older. Olson at 17 tossed a kid into a gymnasium and laughed. Olson at 37 is still who he was at 17. That's one of the film's quieter observations, tucked in between the action set pieces and the one-liners. The people who choose cruelty and never get called on it don't become better. The people who absorb the cruelty and survive it. That's where the real transformation can happen. Though transformation isn't always straightforward, and Bob Stone's version of it is complicated in ways that the rest of the movie slowly unravels. One more thing about the 1996 setting before we leave it. The era matters. Thurber isn't being purely nostalgic, choosing that specific year. There's a structural logic to it. In 1996, when the curtain came down on high school, it actually came down. You moved. People lost touch. Whole chapters of your life sealed shut with a graduation ceremony and then genuinely disappeared. The person who humiliated you on the worst day of your life could, theoretically, become a stranger. Social media ended that. Facebook, specifically, is the hinge on which this movie swings. The platform that collapsed the wall between past and present, that made it possible for Robbie Weirdicht, now operating under the name Bob Stone, to find Calvin Joyner with a single friend request. 20 years, a complete physical transformation, a career in intelligence, and all it takes to drag 1996 back into the present is a notification on a screen, a friend request, from someone Calvin barely remembers. Who remembers everything? That's where the story actually starts, and right now, all of that is still incoming. For this moment, we're still in the gym, still watching Robbie run. Still watching Calvin lower his arms after throwing that jacket across the room, returning to his speech, to his life, to everything that's waiting for him. He has no idea what he just set in motion. 20 years will do that to a person. Not destroy them, not exactly. Calvin Joyner still gets up every morning. He still makes Maggie laugh. He still has the same quick wit that had an entire gymnasium on its feet in 1996. Nothing is broken. Nothing is even close to broken. He's just quieter now. And that's the thing. Calvin's desk at work tells you the whole story without needing a single line of dialogue. Stacks of spreadsheets, a lukewarm coffee, family photo, calendar, stapler, the whole suburban professional setup. Is an accountant at a mid-level firm in Atlanta, good at the job, reliable, the kind of guy colleagues trust to get the numbers right. There's real comfort in that, and the movie doesn't mock him for it. But there's that plaque. Most likely to succeed. His senior year award, framed and sitting right there on his desk. Kevin Hart plays Calvin's relationship to that plaque with beautiful understatement. He doesn't glare at it, doesn't talk about it, just has it there in his eyeline every working day, like a very specific kind of ambient pressure he's learned to tune out. Except he hasn't tuned it out, you can tell. Maggie, meanwhile, is exactly what people expected of her. She's a partner at a prestigious law firm. Sharp, capable, the kind of person who reads a room in 3 seconds and immediately knows where the power sits. Danielle Nicolay brings real depth to what could have been a thankless, supportive wife role. Maggie isn't here to cheer Calvin on from the sidelines or deliver motivational speeches over dinner. She's got her own life, her own career, her own forward momentum. She loves Calvin fiercely. She's also been watching him drift for long enough that she stopped waiting for him to stop on his own, which is why she suggests therapy. The marriage counseling setup hits you at exactly the right moment, just as you're getting a feel for who these two people are now. They're not in crisis. No screaming, no secret keeping, no affair lurking in the wings. What they have is subtler and honestly more true to life. Two people running on different rhythms, not quite reaching each other across the gap that adulthood tends to open between people who are perfectly matched at 22. Calvin's gap is momentum. He had all of it in high school, and somewhere in the years between then and now, it bled away quietly. Maggie's gap is patience. She has enormous amounts of it, but it isn't infinite, and she's smart enough to get ahead of the problem before it becomes unfixable. So, therapy. Good idea, Maggie. What neither of them knows yet is that therapy is about to get significantly more complicated. A certain someone is going to sit in that therapist's chair who very much did not attend graduate school, but that's coming, one thing at a time. The Facebook notification arrives on a normal Tuesday. Calvin's at his desk doing exactly what he does every Tuesday, and his phone buzzes. A friend request from someone named Bob Stone. He stares at it. The name lands with zero recognition attached. Calvin actually has to search, actively scan his mental database, and comes up with nothing solid. The profile photo shows a man with a genuinely extraordinary physique, the kind of build that makes you do a small double take at your screen. He accepts the request because that's just what you do with requests from people the algorithm has already decided are someone you may know. The message comes through almost immediately. Bob Stone wants to meet up. Bob Stone is in town for their 20-year high school reunion. Bob Stone, he clarifies in the chat, is actually Robbie. From high school, Calvin calls Maggie. Their phone conversation is funny, in that very specific, very married way. Calvin is confused. Maggie is vaguely puzzled and vaguely busy. He asks if she remembers Robbie Weird from high school, catching himself mid-name because even now, 20 years on, saying the full surname out loud feels unkind. She doesn't really remember him. Calvin's already half committed to going. She says she'll reschedule the therapy appointment to lunch tomorrow instead. It's a completely unremarkable conversation. 2 minutes of married people logistics, the kind of negotiation that happens in kitchens and parking lots and over text messages every single day. The movie plays it completely straight. No ominous music, no dramatic foreshadowing. Calvin says he'll see her later. Maggie says she loves him. They hang up. He has absolutely no idea what he just agreed to. Here's the thing about the name change. Bob Stone doesn't exist anywhere in their shared history. Robbie Weirdicht is the name Calvin might theoretically remember, if he remembered the guy at all, which he barely does. But Bob Stone is new, constructed, deliberate, built to land with a different weight than the name he was born with. You understand why, right? Weirdicht was a punchline. Not because there's anything wrong with the name, but because that's how it got used. Every time someone said it in high school, there was a pause before it, a little comedic preparation. The name became loaded through sheer repetition. So when Robbie rebuilt himself, and the rebuild was comprehensive, years of work in every possible sense, the name went with everything else. Bob Stone. Solid. Simple. The kind of name that appears on a badge and makes people take you seriously. Choosing a new name isn't just practical, it's a declaration. The person you knew doesn't live here anymore. He's been replaced by someone who can't be touched the same way. The movie will spend a lot of time quietly examining whether that's actually true, whether you can outrun a version of yourself through sheer physical and professional transformation, or whether 1996 always finds a way back. Spoiler, 1996 always finds a way back. 2 details about Calvin's pre-Bob life that matter for everything that follows. First, the reunion. Their 20-year high school reunion is what's pulled Bob back to Atlanta, and it's the event hanging over Calvin's entire emotional arc. He's not excited. Walking through that door means facing people who voted him most likely to succeed and explaining, through small talk and body language, how accountancy happened. He'll do it because Maggie wants to go and because he's not a coward. But the particular social math of a high school reunion, that unspoken comparative judgment running beneath every conversation, is not something he's been looking forward to. Second, a promotion just passed him by at work. It's mentioned briefly, almost in passing, but it lands. A colleague gets congratulated right in front of him. Calvin absorbs it with practiced, good-natured grace. One more small cut on an old wound. Put all of it together and you've got a man who is fundamentally decent, genuinely funny, well-loved, and quietly suffocating under the distance between who he was supposed to become and who he actually is. Kevin Hart could have played this as tragedy. He doesn't. He plays it as a kind of tired self-awareness, the chuckle of someone who knows exactly what's funny about his own situation but isn't quite ready to do anything about it. That's the Calvin Joyner who accepts the friend request. That's the Calvin Joyner who agrees to meet Bob Stone for a drink at a local bar, treating it as a mild social obligation, probably expecting 45 slightly awkward minutes of nostalgic small talk before getting home in time for dinner. The bar is low-lit, comfortable, the kind of Atlanta spot that gets a decent happy hour crowd on a weeknight. Calvin shows up first, finds a table, orders something, checks his phone the way you do when you're early and slightly nervous for reasons you can't fully explain. The door opens. Bob Stone walks in. Part 2 stops right there, right at the threshold, right at the moment of first contact, because what happens when that door opens deserves its own full section, the physical comedy of the reveal. Tate, the way Dwayne Johnson plays this enormous, joyful, slightly unhinged man-child who radiates pure chaotic energy while wearing a unicorn t-shirt. The absolute disruption of everything Calvin thought this evening was going to be. That door opening is a gear shift. The movie that was quietly building in the background suddenly announces what kind of movie it actually is. Calvin has no idea who just walked into his life. 6'4", built like a concept rather than a person, wearing a unicorn t-shirt. Calvin Joyner's face runs through about 6 emotions in 2 seconds flat when Bob Stone walks through that bar door. Surprise, confusion, a hard recalibration, more surprise, and then settles into a smile, because what else do you do when someone this enormous is walking toward you with the unbridled enthusiasm of a dog who just heard a car pull into the driveway? Bob is happy! Radiantly, completely, almost alarmingly happy to see Calvin Joyner. Calvin barely remembers this person. Dwayne Johnson commits to Bob Stone in a way that's genuinely impressive to watch. The character could have gone a dozen safe directions. Gentle, giant action hero with a soft side, intimidating but charming. But Johnson blows past all of those and lands somewhere weirder and more specific. Bob is earnest. Uncalibrated, no filter, zero irony earnest. He walks into that bar beaming, immediately tells Calvin he's his hero, immediately references 1996 with a warmth and precision that Calvin absolutely cannot locate in his own memory. He also has a fanny pack. The fanny pack matters. Not yet for what it contains, though it will contain several things that become plot relevant fast, but for what it says about Bob Stone's relationship with other people's opinions of Bob Stone. There is no self-consciousness here. He found a useful organizational tool and he's using it. The rest of you can do what you want with that information. The unicorn t-shirt operates identically. Calvin arrives in reasonable adult clothes, the outfit of a man who expected 45 minutes of mild nostalgia over drinks. Bob arrives looking like he lost a bet and is completely at peace with the outcome. Together, they make an extraordinary visual pair, and director Rawson Marshall Thurber knows it, staging them side by side at every opportunity. The comedy writes itself. The movie barely has to try. The first real test of who Bob actually is comes not from conversation, but from a situation that Calvin barely registers as a threat. A guy at the bar is being a problem, nothing catastrophic. The kind of drunk, pushy unpleasantness that escalates slowly, the way it does. A man getting in someone's face in a way that's crossing a line while maintaining enough deniability to avoid being clearly over it. Calvin clocks it from the corner of his eye. Makes the standard civilian calculation, not my problem, not my business, let the bartender handle it. Bob makes no such calculation. Before Calvin can process what's happening, Bob is over there, and then the situation is simply over. No speech, no escalation, no dramatic standoff. It's resolved with the speed and precision of someone who handles conflict the way a plumber handles a leaky pipe, professionally, efficiently, and without drama. Bob comes back to the table, sits down, and picks up the conversation at exactly the sentence where he left it. Calvin stares at him. Bob keeps talking. That gap between the quiet violence of what just happened and Bob's absolute serenity about it is doing serious work. The movie is showing you something underneath the fanny pack and the unicorn shirt. There's a competence here that's calibrated, trained, and genuinely formidable. Bob's stone contains multitudes. Most of those multitudes have government clearance. Calvin doesn't know any of this yet. He just saw a man resolve a bar confrontation in about 4 seconds and then ask if he wanted another drink. The cognitive dissonance sits with him for a moment. Then Bob says something enthusiastic about their old high school mascot and Calvin's brain redirects. Of course they end up at the school. Bob has clearly been back before. You can tell by how he navigates it, the comfort of someone who knows where everything is, who's walked these halls in off hours more than once. For Calvin, it's mild nostalgia, walking through a place that was mostly fine, that produced mostly good memories. For Bob, it's something else entirely. The gym pulls him like gravity. Standing under those same bleachers, Bob talks about 1996 with an openness that should feel uncomfortable and somehow doesn't. He doesn't perform emotions, he just has them visibly without apology. He describes what it felt like to be in that room. The laughter, the floor, the moment of absolute exposure. And then Kevin Hart does something very careful in these scenes. Calvin doesn't weep, doesn't suddenly access a flood of long-buried guilt. He listens with the expression of a man who is slowly understanding the actual weight of something he did casually, once, without thinking much about it. The discomfort on his face isn't guilt exactly. It's the reckoning of realizing your smallest act of decency was somebody else's entire lifeline. That's an uncomfortable thing to discover. Bob also shows Calvin what he kept, a yearbook photo, Calvin's senior picture. Hart plays the discovery of this with an actor's restraint, the laugh that starts and then dies because it's not actually funny, it's just a lot. The photo isn't creepy, it isn't shrine-like or obsessive in the way movies sometimes play these reveals. It's the kept thing of someone who, in a sustained period of cruelty and isolation, held onto one piece of evidence that the world contained people worth believing in. Calvin Joyner was that evidence. The movie earns this moment by not explaining it to death. Bob doesn't deliver a monologue about what the gesture meant, he just says something honest, simply, and moves on. Thurber trusts the audience to feel the weight without a musical cue nudging them toward the correct emotion. That kind of restraint in a studio action comedy is rarer than it should be. Calvin's high school was not a kind place for Robbie Weirdicht. The movie isn't interested in dramatizing that further than it already has. The gym scene said everything the gym scene needed to say, but walking the school with Bob fills in the texture. A comment here, a look there, the particular geography of where you're safe and where you're not. Bob navigates it all with a lightness that reads as genuine, which is either a sign of true healing or a very good performance of it. Probably some of both. That ambiguity is one of the more honest things the film does with its central character. Bob Stone is not a trauma case walking around waiting for therapy. He's functional, joyful even, genuinely so. The kid who got thrown into that gym lives inside him too, and the movie is going to keep finding the seams where one bleeds into the other. The ask comes toward the end of the night, casual as a favor between friends. Bob pulls out a piece of paper. Numbers, transactions, financial records, and slides it across the table. He needs someone who understands this stuff, someone he trusts. The numbers are related to something he's been looking into, he says. He can't explain the details yet, but he needs to know if anything looks off. Just look at some numbers, is roughly how he frames it. Calvin examines the figures for a moment. He's a forensic accountant. This is literally his job. The numbers are complex but readable. There are transactions here that don't quite line up. Offshore transfers, figures moving through channels that suggest someone is setting something up. He doesn't have enough context to say what exactly, but he can tell something is happening. He agrees to look further. He should not have agreed. Here's what makes the Bob Stone reveal work as a full sequence rather than just a comedy bit. Dwayne Johnson plays all of it. The bar, the school, the ask, without ever breaking the character's fundamental sincerity. There's no wink, no moment where Bob seems to acknowledge how absurd he is. He exists completely inside his own logic, and that logic is entirely consistent. Calvin Joyner is his hero. This is the greatest night of his adult life, and also he casually needs Calvin's financial expertise for something that may or may not involve the international intelligence community. These things coexist for Bob without tension. That sincerity is what makes him funny. Harity requires self-awareness. Bob has none, and so everything lands as genuinely rather than ironically. The fanny pack isn't a bit, it's just what Bob wears. The unicorn shirt isn't a costume, it's Tuesday. You can't parody someone who doesn't know they're being unusual, and Bob Stone has no idea. Calvin drives home with a head full of competing information. On one side, a genuinely warm night, a surprisingly touching reconnection, a man who turned out to be more interesting than his name and a Facebook notification suggested. On the other, that bar moment. The speed of it. The file of numbers that have more layers than they should for someone asking a casual favor. He isn't alarmed. Not yet. He files it in the weird but probably fine drawer that most people maintain for low-grade social strangeness, tells Maggie about the evening in broad strokes, and goes to sleep thinking he'll look at those numbers in the morning and maybe get coffee with Bob again sometime. The numbers are not fine, and the CIA will be at his door before he finishes his morning coffee, which is going to make everything that felt manageable about this situation very, very quickly stop feeling manageable. Bob Stone just handed Calvin Joyner the most chaotic week of his adult life. He did it wearing a unicorn t-shirt out of pure gratitude with a fanny pack over one shoulder. That tracks. Morning. The kitchen table. The financial records Bob handed him spread out next to a coffee that's actually hot this time. Calvin opens the file with the low-stakes energy of a man doing a mild favor. He's a forensic accountant. Looking at numbers is what he does, has always done, will do until someone throws him a retirement party in the break room and gives him a coffee mug with a bad joke on it. This isn't unusual. This is Tuesday, just with slightly more interesting paperwork. Except the paperwork isn't interesting. It's alarming. The figures don't behave the way legitimate transactions behave. Calvin spots it fast, because this is genuinely his area. Not the spy world, not the action movie world, but the specific world of money moving through channels in ways designed not to be noticed. Shell companies, offshore accounts cycling through jurisdictions chosen specifically for their opacity. Transfer sequences that, if you follow them carefully enough, converge on a single source, a single event, a single sale. Something substantial is being auctioned, and the buyers, traced through the account numbers with the patience of someone who actually knows what he's looking for, are not the kind of entities you want purchasing something substantial, not corporations, not private interests. Buyers from governments and organizations that the U.S. intelligence community spends a significant amount of money and manpower trying to keep their hands off certain things. Calvin sits back, sets down his coffee, picks it up again. The knock at the door lands before he's had time to fully process what he's looking at, and Agent Pamela Harris doesn't wait for a second knock. Amy Ryan plays Harris with a specific, finely calibrated energy. She's not aggressive, not theatrical, not doing the movie, CIA agent thing where everything is stone-faced and sunglasses. She's measured, methodical, the particular competence of someone who has been doing this work long enough to be unimpressed by most things, including confused accountants in suburban kitchens. She comes in with her team, sets the tone immediately, and begins talking before Calvin has fully registered that actual government agents are standing in his house. The information she delivers is clean, structured, and completely devastating. Bob Stone's real name, she confirms, is Robert Weirdicht, changed legally some years back, which Calvin already knew. What Calvin didn't know, Weirdict Stone has been a CIA field operative for the better part of a decade. Decorated, highly trained, considered one of the agency's more effective assets in the field. Past tense, Harris emphasizes. Because Bob Stone went rogue, the agency's case against him is specific. Bob's partner, Field Agent Phil Stanton, Amy Ryan's case file photograph showing a man with an Aaron Paul face, was murdered during an operation. The evidence, according to Harris, points to Bob, not to an unknown third party, not to enemy action, to Bob, his partner, his liability to remove. And the reason Stanton needed to be removed? Because Stanton found out what Bob was actually doing. Satellite codes. Harris explains this with the practiced calm of someone who has delivered a lot of classified briefings to a lot of confused civilians. The codes are military grade, the kind that, in the wrong hands, don't just cause a problem, they cause a cascading, irreversible, very loud problem across multiple continents. Think of them as override keys for systems that should never be overridden by anyone who hasn't been specifically authorized to override them. Bob Stone has been brokering their sale. The buyers in the financial records Calvin was just looking at, those are the bidders. The auction Harris is trying to shut down is real, imminent, and already in motion. The money Calvin tracked this morning is the deposit structure for a transaction that will finalize imminently unless the agency gets there first. Calvin looks at the file still spread across his kitchen table, then at Harris, then at the file. He put those pieces together 20 minutes ago over coffee, thinking it was a strange coincidence. Harris is telling him it's not a coincidence. It's the entire point of why Bob Stone found him. Sit with that for a second. The man who walked into the bar last night glowing with gratitude, wearing a unicorn shirt, talking about a high school yearbook with visible emotion. That man, according to a federal agent now standing in Calvin's kitchen, murdered his own partner and is currently running a multi-million-dollar arms deal with buyers from hostile nations. The fanny pack, Harris notes, probably has at least one weapon in it. Calvin's face in this sequence is doing everything Kevin Hart is best at, the rapid processing of information that shouldn't fit together but apparently does, the collapse and rebuild of a mental model happening visibly across his features. He wants to push back. Wants to say the Bob Stone he met last night didn't feel like a killer. Felt like a man who'd been genuinely, almost heartbreakingly happy to see him. Harris has heard some version of this before. She doesn't look unsympathetic. She just holds her position. Trained operatives, she explains, are specifically trained to make people feel exactly that way. The ask is direct, cooperate. Bob trusts Calvin. That much is clearly true, whether the trust is genuine or manufactured. The agency needs a line to Bob before the auction window closes. Calvin has that line, his phone, his contact, the access that Bob himself created by showing up at that bar. Calvin doesn't agree immediately. He also doesn't say no, which is more or less the same thing in the operational logic Harris is working from. She leaves her contact information, tells him not to reach out to Bob directly, tells him to call her the moment Bob contacts him again. Her team moves efficiently back through his front door, and then Calvin is alone at his kitchen table with the financial records, the cold coffee, the CIA business card, and the extremely specific sensation of having his entire understanding of the previous 12 hours turned inside out. Here's what the movie is doing structurally in this scene, and it's smart enough to be worth pausing on. Harris's story is coherent, detailed, backed by official credentials and a case file and the kind of institutional weight that makes you want to believe it by default. She's not asking Calvin to take a leap of faith. She's presenting evidence, photographs, transaction records that match the records in front of him, a narrative with internal logic. But Bob's behavior last night also had internal logic. The yearbook photo, the genuine emotion walking through the school, the bar incident handled not with cruelty but with quiet precision, the ask that felt not like manipulation but like someone extending trust to the only person who ever extended it to him. Neither story fully cancels the other out, and that's the film's central dramatic engine clicking into gear. Calvin Joyner, forensic accountant, is now in the position of having to figure out who's telling the truth, not with investigative tools or agency resources, but with nothing more than his own read on two people he barely knows. One of them is a trained intelligence operative who does this for a living. The other one might be too. What Harris doesn't give Calvin, and what the movie is careful to withhold here, is any room for ambiguity about her own position. She presents herself as the institutional voice of truth, the government, the correct answer, the responsible party. And she's not obviously wrong. She has a badge. She has evidence. She has a dead partner and a ticking clock in a very legitimate-sounding national security crisis. But Amy Ryan plays the character with just enough certainty, that particular quality of someone who has already decided and is now presenting conclusions rather than building a case, to leave a small crack in the wall. Not doubt exactly. Just enough that a careful viewer files it away. A careful viewer, at this point in the movie, is already doing that. Bob calls while Harris's business card is still in Calvin's hand. Of course he does. The timing is almost comedic. Almost. Except Calvin's hands are doing a thing that isn't quite shaking but isn't quite steady either. Bob's voice through the phone is exactly what it was at the bar. Warm, slightly too loud, operating at an enthusiasm level roughly 3 settings above most normal adults. He wants to know if Calvin looked at the numbers yet. Calvin, with the CIA's instructions still fresh in his ears, says he has. Bob asks if anything looked off, a long beat. Yeah, Calvin says, some things look off. And now the movie has its central dynamic fully assembled. 2 forces pulling at Calvin Joyner from opposite directions. The federal agency in one ear, the possibly rogue, possibly not rogue, CIA operative in the other. The auction clock running somewhere in the background. Maggie in the next room, completely unaware. Calvin Joyner, most likely to succeed, suburban accountant, man who peaked at 17 and has been coasting since, is now directly in the middle of an active intelligence operation. He did not sign up for this. He is, whether he admits it or not, already in. Calvin doesn't get a choice in how the next conversation happens. He's barely hung up the phone when Bob materializes. Not at the door, not with a knock, not with any of the social protocols most people use when they'd like to speak with someone. Bob Stone operates on a logistical frequency entirely his own, one that involves appearing in places with a speed and directness that the CIA probably trained into him and that now applies equally to catching up with old acquaintances. One moment, Calvin is standing in his kitchen holding his phone. The next, he's somewhere else. Bob's explanation comes out in that same warm, slightly too intense voice he uses for everything, which makes it stranger rather than more reassuring. He needs Calvin to hear his version of events before Calvin does anything with that business card Harris left behind. The version goes like this. Yes, he's CIA. Has been for years. Yes, the satellite codes are real. Military-grade override capability. The kind of access that in the wrong hands would represent a catastrophic breach of systems that a lot of people sleep better assuming are secure. Yes, an auction is in motion, buyers lined up, a clock running. But Bob isn't running it. The Black Badger is. The Black Badger is a codename, a specific operational identity belonging to a specific person inside the intelligence community, someone with clearances, institutional knowledge, and enough operational cover to broker this sale without triggering the standard tripwires. An insider, not a foreign agent, not an outside threat, someone already through the door. Bob found out. That's the short version. He'd been tracking inconsistencies for months. Classified operations with strange margins, money routing through channels that sanctioned operations don't use, patterns that only become visible if you're looking specifically for them. Phil Stanton, his partner, was helping him build the case, and then Phil died. Bob's version, Phil was eliminated because he was getting close. The Black Badger moved to cut the thread before it unraveled further. Which means the real killer isn't a rogue agent who went mercenary for the money. It means the real killer is still inside the agency, which means Harris, or someone in Harris's chain of command, might know considerably more than they're letting on. Calvin stares at him. Bob stares back with the patient sincerity of someone who understands this is a lot and is prepared to wait as long as it takes. This is the structural pivot the whole movie hinges on, and it's worth pausing on exactly how the film manages it. Up to this point, 2 completely coherent versions of Bob Stone exist simultaneously. The warm, emotionally transparent man-child from the bar, genuinely moved by an old yearbook photo, genuinely grateful for a jacket thrown across a gym floor 20 years ago, and the dangerous rogue operative from Harris's briefing, with a dead partner, a weapons sale in progress, and a government file that paints him as the threat. Both versions are internally consistent. Both are delivered by credible sources. And Calvin can't verify either one. He's not an investigator. He doesn't have clearance. What he has is his read on people, which has always been sharp, and the specific texture of the conversation happening in front of him. Bob doesn't talk like someone running a cover story. He talks like someone who is genuinely, bone-deep exhausted by not being believed. That's either real or the single most convincing performance Calvin has ever been on the receiving end of. The movie isn't telling you which one yet. Hold the question. It matters later. What Bob actually needs from Calvin becomes clear, fast. The auction has a physical endpoint. A deadline, a location, an in-person exchange designed specifically to avoid electronic traces. Old-school tradecraft. Bob needs to be present when it happens. He needs to identify the black badger in the act, with evidence clean enough to survive whatever internal interference might be waiting back at the agency. He needs the financial thread Calvin already started pulling. Calvin is, apparently, the only forensic accountant Bob trusts with his life, which is genuinely touching. It is also an absolutely insane sentence to be on the receiving end of when you went to bed last night thinking this week would involve spreadsheets and couples therapy. "Just help me follow the money," Bob says, in the tone of a man who genuinely believes this is a reasonable request. Calvin is now in the movie, fully, whether he officially signed up or not. The couples therapy scene arrives like a hand grenade in a sitcom. Setup: Calvin and Maggie have a scheduled session with their therapist, a normal appointment, part of the ongoing maintenance work on a marriage that's slightly out of alignment. Calvin shows up. Maggie is already seated. And behind the therapist's desk, occupying the therapist's chair with the approximate physical presence of a particularly attentive boulder, is Bob Stone, in a cardigan, with a notepad. Maggie has never met Bob. She knows the name. Calvin mentioned grabbing a drink with an old-school acquaintance, but she's never seen the face, never encountered the body, never had the specific experience of processing Dwayne Johnson in a therapeutic context. Her reaction deserves its own paragraph. She doesn't scream, doesn't immediately walk out. She goes very still, the particular stillness of an extremely composed person whose operating parameters have been suddenly and completely exceeded. Maggie is a lawyer. She handles surprises professionally. This specific surprise is testing the outer wall of that professionalism in ways it has never been tested before. Bob plays the therapist with absolute commitment. That's what makes this sequence genuinely funny rather than just surreal. He doesn't break. Doesn't apologize for the confusion or acknowledge that anything unusual is happening. He has the notepad. He has the posture. He maintains a quality of focused, attentive therapeutic presence that would be convincing if he were roughly 40% smaller and had at any point attended graduate school. He asks about their communication patterns. Maggie looks at Calvin. Calvin looks at his hands. Bob writes something down with visible care. The comedy runs on a specific track that this film handles particularly well. The humor isn't in the situation being played for laughs, it's in the situation being played completely straight by someone who sees absolutely nothing funny about it. Bob genuinely wants to help this marriage. He's heard Calvin talk about Maggie with real warmth and admiration. The fact that he's simultaneously an international fugitive being hunted by a federal agency is simply a parallel operational concern he's managing at the same time. The man can multitask. What sneaks up on you, underneath the comedy, underneath Maggie's barely controlled bewilderment and Calvin's barely controlled panic, is that Bob is actually perceptive in that room. Not trained. Good. Not technically competent. Genuinely perceptive in the way people become when they've spent years paying close attention to human beings because their life depended on reading the room accurately. Bob went through something that either makes you stop caring about human connection entirely or makes you hyper-attuned to it. He went the second direction. He identifies something real about Calvin and Maggie's dynamic. Something true that Calvin would never have said out loud in a formal therapy session, and probably not in private either. He says it plainly, without cruelty, without fully registering that most people use filters for this kind of observation. Calvin and Maggie go quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind, the other kind, where something has been named that needed naming and both people in the marriage feel it land. The movie doesn't underline this, doesn't swell the music or hold on faces for an extra beat. Thurber knows which comedy scenes are doing emotional work on the side, and he trusts the audience to catch it. The moment gets tucked away quietly, saved for later when the arc needs something real to anchor to. They exit the building with the pace of two people who need to not be there anymore. Out on the street, Calvin's personal inventory looks like this: one CIA business card unused in his pocket, one set of financial records tracing an imminent weapons auction, one official narrative from a federal agent, one contradictory narrative from a man who just impersonated a therapist, one extremely confused wife with a backlog of follow-up questions, and the mounting awareness that the window for a calm, rational decision about his involvement has been open and is now definitively closed. He's in. He knows it. Bob knows it. The film has been architecting toward exactly this moment since the Facebook notification buzzed on a boring Tuesday. Something the movie establishes quietly through all of this: Bob's emotional intelligence isn't a contradiction of his operational capability. They're the same thing, coming from the same root. Years of reading people, first as survival, then as craft, built a kind of perception that works identically whether the context is a CIA field operation or a suburban couple's therapy session. Same skill, different application. Calvin is starting to understand that the person beside him is more layered than either Harris's case file or his own first impression accounted for. A man who can neutralize a bar threat in 4 seconds and correctly identify a marital fault line in 40 minutes of fake therapy is not a simple thing to categorize. More complex than expected doesn't mean innocent. The movie isn't making that argument. But it's making the case that the binary, Bob is guilty, Harris is right, end of story, doesn't survive contact with the actual human being. The auction clock is still running. The Black Badger is still out there, inside an agency that's currently pointing all its resources at Bob Stone, while the real threat operates behind that cover. And Calvin Joyner, forensic accountant, man who peaked at 17, suburban husband with a morning coffee habit and a reunion he was already dreading, is now actively assisting a CIA fugitive, holding classified financial intelligence and moving through a situation that has precisely zero overlap with anything in his job description, most likely to succeed. Sure, finance trails don't lie. That's the first principle of everything Calvin does for a living. Money moves with intention. Transactions have architecture, even when the architecture is deliberately obscured. Especially then, actually. The more complex the routing, the more specific the destination someone is trying to hide. Pull the thread with patience, follow the account numbers through their shell structures and jurisdictional smokescreens, and the picture assembles. The picture, assembled, has Trevor Olson's name on it. There's a specific kind of person who ends up in the gray zone of high-end financial brokerage. Not quite banking, not quite consulting, operating in the lucrative space between legitimate institutional money and the kind of transactions that need a professional buffer between themselves and direct scrutiny. Trevor Olson, 37 years old and still carrying the low-grade swagger of a man who was never properly checked, has built a comfortable life in exactly that space. He's good at it. That's the frustrating part. People like Olson often are good at it, because the same quality that made him a bully at 17, the ability to read what people want to hear and give it to them, to perform whatever version of himself the situation requires, turns out to be professionally valuable in environments that reward social flexibility over substance. He's not a genius. He's just never been forced to be honest, and that particular freedom, maintained long enough, produces a specific kind of success. Bob and Calvin need what he knows, so they go to him. The meeting starts with an apology. Nobody asked for one. This wasn't the agenda, and Calvin wasn't expecting it. But Olson sees Bob walk through the door, and something shifts in his face. Maybe the sheer physical reality of what Robbie Weirdicht became prompts it. Maybe there's some version of a conscience buried somewhere in there that occasionally surfaces at inconvenient moments. Whatever the reason, Olson says the words. He's sorry, for high school, for what happened in the gym. He knows it was wrong. Bob goes completely still. This is the moment the movie has been quietly building toward since the opening sequence. The specific, impossible-to-fake stillness of someone who waited 20 years to hear those exact words and doesn't quite know what to do now that they've arrived. Watch Bob in this sequence. Johnson drops the performative warmth, the big personality, all the Bob Stone energy that fills every room he enters. What's underneath is quieter, more exposed. Robbie Weirdicht is right there under the surface, accepting an apology, trying to believe it's real. It isn't real, not entirely, not in the way that matters. The words are technically there, the form of an apology, the vocabulary of remorse, but Olson delivers them the way he delivers everything, as a social transaction, a thing said to produce a desired outcome in the person he's saying it to. He needs Bob, calm and cooperative. A moment of apparent vulnerability costs him nothing and buys him leverage. He's done this calculation before with different people in different rooms, and it has always worked. For about 30 seconds, it looks like it might work on Bob too. Then Olson makes a comment, just a small one, a throwaway. The specific flavor of cruelty that presents itself as humor, the kind of thing that requires you to prove you're a bad sport if you object to it, a reference to the past that's technically just a joke, technically not a big deal, just a bit of banter between old classmates who've moved on. It lands exactly the way it's designed to land. Bob's face doesn't crumple, doesn't collapse dramatically. The movie doesn't go for the obvious emotional breakdown, because that's not who Bob Stone is, and more importantly, that's not how this specific kind of wound actually works. What happens is quieter and, for that reason, harder to watch. He recalibrates. The wall goes back up. Not the cheerful warmth of Bob Stone performing normalcy, but the operational version, the one that's all surface and no access. His eyes flatten slightly. His voice adjusts. He's still sitting in the same chair in the same room, but something behind his eyes has stepped back and closed a door. Calvin catches it. The movie trusts Kevin Hart to catch it, and he does. A single beat of recognition on his face, quick and private, like he filed something important and will return to it later. Nobody transforms the way Bob transformed without fuel. That's the thing this scene finally says out loud, or almost out loud. The years of physical work, the career built from scratch, the name change, the whole project of becoming someone who can't be laughed at the way Robbie Weirdicht was laughed at, that doesn't happen on ambition alone. It happens on something that needs to prove something, specifically to someone. Specifically to everyone in that gym. Bob Stone exists, in some measurable part, because of Trevor Olson. That's a complicated thing to sit with. Not gratitude. Nobody should have to be grateful for cruelty. But the film is honest about causality. The intensity of the transformation tracks the intensity of the wound. You don't build that much. Change that completely. Reach that deep into yourself for capability you didn't know existed, without something driving the excavation. What drives it matters, because the thing that drives it doesn't go away just because the transformation is complete. It waits, and when Olson tosses that comment out like it costs nothing, the driver kicks back in, and Bob feels 17 again despite everything he's built since then. The information exchange happens anyway because it has to. This is where Bob's operational discipline earns its keep. Whatever just happened emotionally, the mission doesn't pause for it. The auction clock is running. The account details need to be traced further. Bob asks the specific questions Calvin prepped him to ask, in the specific sequence that will yield the specific information they need without tipping Olson to exactly how much they already know. Olson, recalibrated back into professional mode himself, provides it, because the business proposition still makes sense to him, and Trevor Olson has never let personal dynamics get in the way of a transaction that benefits Trevor Olson. They get what they came for. Walking out, Calvin says something to Bob. Not much. A few words, the conversational equivalent of acknowledging that what happened back there wasn't nothing. Bob deflects it the way he deflects most things, that require him to admit he's anything other than fine, with a quick subject change, a slightly too wide smile, forward momentum. Calvin doesn't push. He's a smart man. He knows there's a limit to what Bob will receive right now, and he also knows that pushing past that limit produces nothing useful except distance. So he lets it sit, files it, returns to the problem in front of them. But the dynamic between them has shifted, and both of them feel it. Calvin is no longer the reluctant bystander managing an inconvenient situation. He's a partner now, not in the official sense, not with a badge or a clearance level, but in the sense that matters. He's paying attention to Bob Stone, the person, not just Bob Stone, the operational situation. That attentiveness is going to matter, more than either of them knows right now. The Olsen scene does something else. The movie handles with more care than its genre usually requires. It refuses to make the bully's arc redemptive. A lot of films in this space would give Olsen a moment of genuine reckoning. Some version of seeing the magnitude of what he did, truly feeling it, being changed by the confrontation. It would be narratively tidy. It would also be dishonest, because the real-world version of Trevor Olson, the person who coasts on social fluency and never pays a real price for casual cruelty, rarely gets that moment, rarely seeks it. The apology was real enough for him to feel like a decent person for offering it, and the joke that followed was real enough that he didn't notice it undermined the whole thing. He left that interaction thinking he handled it well. That's the part that stings. Bob is quiet for longer than usual as they work through the next layer of the financial thread. Calvin fills the silence by doing what Calvin does, following the numbers, pulling the structure apart, mapping the architecture of money that's trying not to be found. It's useful work, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't require conversation, which right now is exactly what the dynamic needs. The account structure, as it continues to reveal itself, has layers that point increasingly towards someone operating from inside. The routing choices, specific institutional channels, clearance-flagged bypass routes, aren't available to an outside actor. This is someone who knows the system because they built part of it, someone who uses the agency's own infrastructure as cover. The Black Badger isn't hiding behind the institution. The Black Badger is using the institution as camouflage. Bob knew this already, has known it for months. Seeing Calvin arrive at the same conclusion independently, following nothing but the money, produces something on his face that isn't quite relief but is adjacent to it. He's been carrying this alone long enough that having someone else see it, someone whose professional judgment has nothing to do with loyalty or agenda, matters more than Bob would probably say out loud. Two people now. Same evidence, same conclusion. The case is getting real. Harris moves fast when she decides to move. No warning, no escalation through polite channels. She shows up where she knows Calvin will feel it most. Not at his office, not in a parking lot, but at home, at the place that contains Maggie. And she makes the situation clear with the efficiency of someone who has run this exact play before and knows precisely how quickly it works on civilians who love someone. Cooperate fully and immediately, or Maggie gets pulled into this, not as a suspect. Harris is too careful for that framing, but obstruction is a word with elastic definitions in national security contexts, and proximity to an active federal fugitive, even innocent, unknowing proximity, can create complications, legal complications, career complications, the kind of complications that take years and considerable money to untangle, and that leave marks even after they're resolved. Maggie's name, Maggie's career, Maggie's entire forward momentum, threatened as leverage. Calvin's face goes somewhere difficult. Maggie doesn't deserve any of this. That's the thought sitting behind his eyes while Harris talks. Not panic, not calculation, just the specific, burning clarity of a man watching his mistake reach sideways and grab someone who had nothing to do with it. Maggie didn't accept the friend request, didn't look at the numbers, didn't get in the car when Bob Stone materialized with the story about satellite codes and insider threats. She went to work, did her job, came home, tried to hold a marriage together while her husband got gradually consumed by something he kept telling her was fine. She is the collateral consequence of choices she wasn't consulted about. That is an unbearable thing to be responsible for. Calvin makes the call. Not immediately. The movie doesn't rush this moment, and it shouldn't. There's a beat where you watch him sit with the full weight of what he's about to do. He has Bob's number on his phone. Bob trusts him completely, in that unguarded, no-reservation way that Bob trusts very few people. That trust was given to Calvin specifically because of 1996, because of a jacket thrown across a gym floor, because Bob Stone built his entire case for human decency on a single gesture made by a 17-year-old kid who probably forgot it happened by the following Monday. And now, Calvin is going to use that trust to hand Bob to the people Bob told him not to trust. He makes the call anyway. The setup is simple. Calvin tells Bob he needs to meet, that there are new developments in the financial records, that he has something Bob needs to see in person. His voice holds. That's the remarkable thing. Anyone watching him from outside the room would see a composed man having a calm phone conversation. On the inside, he's running a much louder internal monologue that he is choosing, deliberately, not to listen to. Bob agrees immediately. Of course he does. Calvin is his person, his one reliable anchor in a situation where everyone else is either a threat or an unknown. He shows up at the meeting point without hesitation, without surveillance, without the operational caution that has kept him ahead of the agency for this long. Because it's Calvin. He doesn't check his back. Harris's team moves the moment Bob is in range. It's quick, professional, the particular efficiency of people who have trained for exactly this and encounter very little resistance because the person they're detaining has already, at some level, decided not to run. Not from Calvin, not in front of Calvin. He could get out. There's a version of this scene where Bob, with everything he's capable of, makes the extraction significantly more complicated for everyone involved. He doesn't. He looks at Calvin. That look is the scene. Everything else is logistics. It isn't accusation exactly. It isn't betrayal face in the melodramatic sense. No wounded expression, no sharp intake of breath, no moment where he makes Calvin feel the full theatrical weight of what just happened. Bob Stone is not built for that kind of emotional performance. What his face does instead is quieter and considerably worse, recognition. the specific recognition of someone who has been here before, who understands what this moment means, who has had their read on a person turn out to be wrong in ways that cost them. For a second, just a second, he looks exactly like Robbie Weirdicht standing on a gymnasium floor. Then the agents have him and he goes, and the look is gone. Calvin stands where he was standing and doesn't move for longer than is probably normal. Guilt has a specific weight. It doesn't feel like guilt immediately. The nervous system is still in the mode that made the decision, still holding the logic that made it feel necessary. Maggie, the career, the leverage, the math that said this was the only reasonable move. That logic is solid and intact, and it doesn't make standing there feel any better. Harris gives him a brief nod of acknowledgement on her way past. Professional. Not unkind. The nod of someone who understands that this was hard and recognizes the cost and has no time to engage with either because she has an operative to process and an auction clock that is still, despite everything, running. Calvin goes home, tells Maggie as much as he can tell her. She listens, asks the questions she needs to ask, processes the information with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a lawyer who is simultaneously the wife in this situation and therefore processing two layers of everything at once. She doesn't yell. The movie doesn't give her a yelling scene, and that restraint is correct. Maggie is too smart and too careful to yell when she doesn't yet have the full picture. But she asks one question, quietly, at the end. Does Calvin believe Bob is actually guilty? The pause before he answers tells her everything. The detention facility is gray and procedural and very much not the place where Bob Stone belongs, in the way that a very large, very energetic thing placed in a very small, very still room creates a wrongness that the room itself seems to register. Harris leads the interrogation. Her questions are structured, methodical, building a case, filling gaps, extracting confirmation of things the agency already suspects. Bob, to his credit, does not simply fold. He answers what he chooses to answer, stays silent where silence is more useful, keeps his voice at the same level whether the question is routine or specifically designed to destabilize him. The operational training holds even in a context where the opposition is technically his own employer. He doesn't mention Calvin's role in getting him here. That detail, the deliberate choice to protect the person who just handed him over, Calvin finds out about later, and it lands harder than almost anything else in the film. The moment Calvin decides is quiet. No trigger, no dramatic speech from Maggie, no sign from the universe, no sudden clarity delivered by a plot contrivance. He's sitting with what he knows. Bob's version of events is coherent and supported by the financial evidence Calvin built himself. Harris's case is also coherent, but it depends on accepting that every instinct Calvin has about Bob Stone is wrong, that the warmth is manufactured, that the therapy session was a manipulation, that the look on Bob's face when he realized what was happening, that specific flash of Robbie Weirdicht behind the trained composure, was also a performance. Calvin is a forensic accountant. He follows evidence. The evidence in the financial records points to an insider, not to Bob. He gets up. Doing the right thing rarely feels clean. It feels, in this case, like walking back into a situation you just extracted yourself from at considerable personal cost, with no guarantee that the second attempt will produce a different outcome. It feels like calling in a favor from someone who might reasonably no longer owe him one. It feels like explaining to Maggie where he's going with just enough information to be honest and not quite enough to make her try to stop him. Maggie, who understands people, watches him leave with the expression of someone who has already run the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that her husband is going to do this whether she supports it or not, and that supporting it is therefore the choice available to her. She's not happy about it. She also knows he's right. Calvin does not have tactical training, combat skills, or any of the operational competencies that a situation like this technically requires. What he has is access. The civilian access that Harris's team didn't fully secure because they never anticipated that the asset they used to bring Bob in would turn around and want him back out. He uses it with a directness that surprises even him. Bob, when Calvin appears in his peripheral vision, looks at him for a long moment. Nothing on his face has fully resolved yet. The trust that was broken, the choice to protect Calvin anyway, the math of what this reappearance means. There's a version of Bob Stone that walks away from Calvin Joyner here and doesn't look back. The operational logic would support it. Self-preservation would support it. Instead, Bob moves. They get out, running through a corridor that neither of them is supposed to be in. Bob slightly ahead, Calvin considerably more out of breath. The dynamic between them is permanently different from what it was 48 hours ago. They're past the point of Bob being Calvin's responsibility and Calvin being Bob's nostalgia project. Thus the point of gratitude and obligation running in one direction. What they are now is two people who've hurt each other and showed up anyway, which is a significantly more honest foundation for a partnership than the one they started with. Calvin put Bob in a room. Bob protected Calvin from it. Calvin came back. The ledger doesn't balance cleanly, and the movie doesn't pretend it does, but they're moving in the same direction, toward the same thing, and the auction is still running, and the Black Badger is still out there, and there is work left to do. Calvin can barely breathe from the sprint. Bob doesn't mention it. Phil Stanton is alive. Sit with that for a moment. Not too long, because the movie doesn't give you long, but enough to feel the full seismic shift of what that means for everything built up to this point. Harris's case against Bob rested on a foundation, a dead partner, evidence pointing to Bob as the killer, a motive tied to the auction. Remove the corpse from that equation and the entire architecture wobbles. Phil Stanton, CIA field operative, supposedly killed in the line of duty, currently very much breathing, shows up in the film with the specific energy of someone who has been operating in the shadows long enough that reappearing in plain sight feels like a power move rather than a revelation. Aaron Paul plays him lean and coiled. None of the warmth Bob projects, none of the institutional solidity Harris performs. Stanton is something else, sharp, watchful, the kind of person who measures every room they enter in terms of exit routes and vulnerabilities. He doesn't radiate threat, he radiates calculation, which is considerably more unsettling. The auction window is closing. That's the context pressing down on every scene from here forward. A deadline not measured in days anymore but in hours. A transaction that will finalize at a specific place and time regardless of what Bob and Calvin or Harris and the agency managed to do before then. The satellite codes have buyers, the buyers have deposited, the infrastructure is in place. The only variable still in motion is whether someone gets to the exchange point with enough evidence to stop it before it completes. Bob has been racing this clock for months. He's been close before, close enough to see the shape of it, and every time he's gotten close, something has pushed him back. His partner died, except his partner didn't die. His partner disappeared, which turns out to be a very different thing with very different implications. The question now isn't just who the Black Badger is. The question is how deep the deception goes. Stanton's alive presence requires a full recalibration of the operational picture, and the movie walks Calvin through that recalibration in real time, which is one of the smarter choices Thurber makes in the back half of the film. Rather than cutting ahead to the characters already knowing the updated information, we experience the reassembly alongside Calvin, who has no intelligence background, no clearance, no tradecraft, and that grounded civilian perspective keeps the plot mechanics from collapsing into self-referential spy jargon. Calvin follows money. Money doesn't have allegiances. Money doesn't have cover stories or handler relationships or interagency politics. It just moves, and where it moves tells you what's actually happening, regardless of what anyone's official position claims. He traces Stanton's financial signature through the same account structures he's been mapping since the beginning, and Stanton is there, not as a victim, not as a peripheral figure, as a node. A consistent, recurring, operationally central node in the transaction architecture the Black Badger built. Phil Stanton didn't stumble into this operation. Phil Stanton helped design it. Bob's reaction to this information is the most guarded thing we've seen from him since the movie started. Every other hard revelation, Harris's accusations, Olsen's cruelty, Calvin's betrayal and return, Bob has processed with some version of visible emotion, however briefly. The wall goes up, but you see the impact before it does. Stanton's involvement produces something different, a settling almost. The specific expression of someone who suspected something and is now watching their worst-case hypothesis get confirmed. He knew, or close to knew. Some version of this was already inside him. The possibility that the person he trusted most in the field, the partner he'd built years of operational trust with, was the reason the thread kept getting cut before he could pull it all the way through. He never said it out loud before now. Saying it out loud doesn't make it easier, it just makes it true. Here's what the Stanton reveal does to the film's emotional geography, beyond the plot mechanics. Bob Stone's entire post-1996 project has been about finding out who can be trusted. The transformation, the career, the move away from Robbie Weirdicht and toward someone harder to laugh at. Underneath all of it, that's the animating question. Who actually shows up when it counts? The world gave him one data point at 17 in the form of Calvin Joyner and a varsity jacket, and he has been working from that single data point ever since. Phil Stanton was supposed to be the second data point, a partner in the full operational sense of the word, someone whose reliability you stake your life on because the work requires it and because you've made the calculated decision that this person is worth staking your life on. Bob made that decision, built years of professional trust on it, went to the mat for it when internal pressures suggested he shouldn't. The return on that investment is Phil Stanton's name on a financial architecture designed to sell military override codes to the highest bidder, with Bob Stone framed as the fall guy. That's not a small betrayal. That's the kind that makes you question your own judgment at the root level, the read on people, the instinct that got you this far, the fundamental faith in your own ability to know who someone is. Calvin watches Bob process this and says nothing. Right move. Calvin's own loyalties are complicated in a different way by the Stanton development. He believed Harris because Harris had institutional authority, documented evidence, and a coherent narrative. He believed Bob because his gut said the warmth was real and the financial records supported the conspiracy theory. He turned Bob in because Maggie's safety required it. He broke Bob out because the evidence required it. Now Stanton is alive and connected to the operation, which means Harris's foundation is compromised, whether Harris knows it or not. And that's the fork in the road that Calvin has to navigate without a map. Does Harris know Stanton is alive? Is she hunting Bob genuinely, operating on false intelligence fed to her by the actual bad actors? Or does she know more than her clean institutional presentation suggests? Calvin has no way to answer that definitively. What he has is the money trail, which keeps pointing somewhere specific, and his read on Bob Stone, which has survived being tested in ways most partnerships never face. Calvin's instincts have been right before. He's going to bet on them again. The shape of the Black Badger starts to sharpen, not a full reveal. The film is saving the explicit confirmation for the climax, but enough that both Bob and Calvin, comparing notes, triangulating from different angles of the same evidence, can see the outline of who's been running this, the insider access, the specific clearance levels required for the bypass routes in the financial records, the operational knowledge to frame Bob Stone convincingly enough that the agency mobilized against him without questioning the narrative. Whoever the Black Badger is, they're good. Professionally, architecturally, tactically good. This wasn't improvised. This was a plan built over time, with patience, with the kind of institutional knowledge you only accumulate by being trusted for years before you decide to stop deserving it. Bob thinks about who fits that profile. Calvin runs the money one more time. They arrive at the same outline simultaneously, from opposite directions, using completely different disciplines. The outline has a face. The decision to go to the exchange point isn't really a decision. Both of them know it. The auction finalizes there, in person. The old-school tradecraft choice that was supposed to make it untraceable is now the exact quality that makes it stoppable, because you have to be physically present to complete a transaction designed to leave no electronic record. The Black Badger will be there. Stanton will be there, the codes will be there. If Bob and Calvin aren't there, it closes. Clean. Done. If they are there, with what Calvin has built from the financial records, a documented case, a money trail that survives legal scrutiny, proof that doesn't rely on Bob's credibility alone, then the narrative changes. The frame around Bob Stone collapses. The real operational picture becomes visible to people who have the authority to act on it. This is the plan. It is not a good plan in the sense of being low risk or well-resourced or supported by people with badges and extraction protocols. It is a good plan only in the sense of being the one available option that could actually work. Bob has operated on worse odds. Calvin has not. Calvin has operated primarily on spreadsheets and coffee. But the version of Calvin who walked into a bar to meet an old acquaintance and the version of Calvin preparing to walk into an active intelligence exchange are, surprisingly, both recognizable as the same person, the same fundamental character, just with considerably higher stakes on the current Tuesday. Maggie gets one more phone call before they move. Calvin keeps it short. Tells her he loves her, tells her the reunion is probably going to be interesting this year, doesn't tell her where he's going or what happens if it goes wrong because there's no version of that conversation that ends with either of them feeling better. Maggie, who is a smart woman, listens to the things he doesn't say. She tells him she loves him, tells him to be careful with a specificity that suggests she already knows. Careful is relative at this point. Tells him to come home. He says he will. The clock says they're out of time. Bob is already at the door. Concrete, fluorescent light, the particular acoustic flatness of an underground space that swallows sound at the edges and amplifies it in the middle. The exchange point is a parking garage. Old-school tradecraft, chosen specifically because it doesn't ping servers or leave digital traces, because a physical handoff in a location without cameras completes a transaction in a way that no financial forensics, however sharp, can fully reconstruct after the fact. No record, no trail. Just two parties in a concrete room, codes change hands, the Black Badger walks away clean, and the world gets considerably less safe without knowing exactly when or why. Bob and Calvin arrive before the exchange completes. Barely. Bob moves differently here. All the warmth, all the wide-open enthusiasm, all the unicorn shirt energy that defines Bob Stone in every other context. Gone. Not suppressed, not performed over, just genuinely set aside, the way a professional sets aside everything not useful to the immediate situation. What's left is something focused and absolutely precise, moving through the garage levels with the directional certainty of someone who has done threat assessment in tighter spaces than this and survived every time. Elvin stays close and does not ask questions. This is the correct approach. The garage has multiple levels and multiple entrances, which means multiple problems, which means Bob has already mapped the geometry of the situation before Calvin has finished registering where the staircases are. Bob communicates in short, flat bursts. Move here, stay there, don't touch that. And Calvin, who has spent considerable personal energy over the preceding 72 hours developing trust in Bob Stone's operational judgment, follows each instruction without the instinct to negotiate that would have been his default 3 days ago. Growth. Extremely high stakes, involuntary growth, but growth. Stanton doesn't look surprised when Bob finds him. That's the detail that lands hardest, not the confrontation itself, not the words exchanged, but the complete absence of shock on Stanton's face when the person he spent months framing for murder walks into the room, very much alive and very much present. There's a readiness there, a preparation, like some part of Stanton always knew that framing Bob Stone might buy time but probably wouldn't finish it. You don't survive everything. Bob survived by being easy to finish. Aaron Paul plays this confrontation with a stillness that sits in contrast to every other dynamic in the film. No bluster, no villain speech. Stanton is just a man who made a series of calculated choices and is now facing the downstream consequences of those calculations, measuring in real time whether there are moves left that change the outcome. His read, probably not. His response, try anyway. The gunfight starts fast and gets faster. Stanton doesn't come alone. The operational tradecraft that got him this far includes not walking into a physical exchange without backup, and the backup materializes from the garage's upper levels with the practiced efficiency of hired muscle that knows the space and expects to use it. Bob's response is immediate, physical, and extraordinarily competent in a way that makes the bar scene from the beginning of the movie look like a warm-up stretch. Calvin hits the ground. This is also the correct approach. What you're watching in this sequence, underneath the choreography, underneath the kinetic energy of the action, is the complete picture of Bob Stone. Not Bob, the enthusiastic, emotionally transparent, unicorn shirt-wearing man who tears up over old yearbook photos. Not Robbie Weirdicht, the kid who ran out of a gymnasium holding a borrowed jacket. Both of those people are real, and both of those people are present, but what the parking garage calls forward is the version that all those years of work in service of something actually built. Bob Stone is extremely good at his job. Not action movie good, in the winking, physics-defying sense, good in the way that trained professionals are good, efficient, adaptive, calibrated to the actual threat level rather than the theatrical version of it. He doesn't perform this, he just does it, with the same flat focus he used to navigate the garage levels, and the people in his way encounter the consequence of engaging with someone who has been preparing for exactly this kind of moment for over a decade. Every rep, every year, every mile of distance between Bob Stone and the gym floor he ran off in 1996 is in this sequence somewhere, converted into competence. Calvin, from his position on the concrete, is doing his own version of the work. The satellite codes are the endpoint, not Stanton, not the backup, not the confrontation itself. The codes are what this entire operation has been about, and the exchange is still technically in progress until someone physically secures them and removes them from the transaction. That's the job. That's what stops the auction from completing, even if Stanton slips through. Calvin can see where the codes are. He can't shoot his way there, can't fight his way there. What he can do is read the room with the specific, practical intelligence of someone who has been following this particular thread since a kitchen table and a morning coffee, who understands the operational architecture of this transaction better than anyone in the garage because he mapped it himself. He moves. Getting grazed by a bullet is not something any action movie communicates accurately in advance. The movies tend to go one of two directions. Either the graze is nothing, dismissed with a wince and a hand press and then forgotten, or it's dramatically incapacitating, a reason to stop and produce a speech. What happens to Calvin is neither of those things. It's sharp, immediate, and disorienting in a way that short-circuits about 3 seconds of forward momentum before the adrenaline catches up and he keeps moving because the alternative is staying still, which is worse. He gets the codes. That's the sequence. Not elegant, not choreographed, a determined accountant from Atlanta, bleeding slightly, crossing a concrete floor while a CIA operative fights trained backup 20 feet away, grabbing the physical carrier of something that several hostile buyers paid significant deposits for, and pulling it out of the transaction before the transaction closes. Calvin Joyner, most likely to succeed. Turns out, Stanton is contained by the time Harris arrives. Because Harris does arrive, with her team, with authority, moving into the garage with the expression of someone whose operation just became significantly more complicated than the briefing suggested. The scene she walks into doesn't match the narrative she's been running. Bob Stone is not the threat in the room. Bob Stone is standing over a contained Phil Stanton, with a civilian who has physical possession of the codes and a documented financial case that Harris's team is going to spend a long time working through. The moment Harris sees the full picture, something shifts in her face. The movie handles this carefully, and the care is correct. Harris isn't the villain of this story. She was handed compromised intelligence by someone operating inside her own agency, built her case on that intelligence in good faith, and pursued it with the institutional authority and procedural competence she brings to everything. She was used. That doesn't feel good to discover. Amy Ryan plays the recalibration with the particular controlled expression of someone absorbing a significant professional and personal blow without letting it destabilize the work that still needs to be done in the next 10 minutes. The work still needs to be done. She does it. Stanton in custody. Code secured. The auction architecture that Calvin mapped through shell companies and offshore routing and clearance-flagged bypass channels, dismantled, not by a counterintelligence team with months of preparation, by two people, one trained operative who never stopped believing in his own case, despite everything working against him, and one forensic accountant who got a Facebook notification on a Tuesday and made a series of increasingly complicated decisions that somehow all pointed in the same direction. The right direction? Bob doesn't celebrate. That's worth noting. There's no moment of arms raised triumph, no cathartic release of the tension that's been building since he first started pulling at this thread. He looks at Stanton for a long moment, the partner he trusted, the person who tried to bury him, and the look contains too many things to name cleanly. Then he turns to Calvin. The look he gives Calvin is different, still complicated. The betrayal from the detention facility is still in there, acknowledged and not yet fully resolved. But above that, and more present than that, is something that doesn't require analysis. Bob Stone is looking at the second person who showed up for him when it actually cost something to show up. He only has 2 data points in that category. Both of them are Calvin Joyner. The garage empties of tactical personnel, reports get filed, chains of custody get established, the bureaucratic machinery of an intelligence operation closing moves through the space and begins converting chaos back into documentation. Calvin is sitting on a bumper somewhere, hand pressed to the graze wound, processing the specific particular experience of having been in a gunfight when his professional qualifications are entirely in financial forensics. His breathing has evened out. The adrenaline is metabolizing into something exhausted and strange. Bob sits next to him. Doesn't say anything for a minute. Then he says something approximately like, "The codes are safe, Stanton is in custody, and Calvin should probably get that looked at." Calvin says something approximately like, "He's aware." Bob says, "The reunion is tomorrow." Calvin looks at him. Bob is already smiling. That wide, full, uncomplicated Bob Stone smile that has no irony in it and no performance and nothing behind it except genuine warmth directed at the specific person sitting on the bumper next to him. The reunion is tomorrow. After everything, the bar, the numbers, the CIA, the detention facility, the concrete floor, the grays, the reunion is tomorrow, and Bob Stone has been looking forward to it since the Facebook friend request went through. Calvin, who was dreading it 48 hours ago, finds that he is no longer sure he is. 20-year reunions are brutal by design. Nobody talks about this openly, but everyone walking through the door knows it. The whole event is structured, socially and architecturally, as a comparative audit. Who became what? Who delivered on the promise of their senior superlative? Who overshot expectations and who quietly didn't? And whether the gap between those two groups is visible from across a gymnasium that looks, somehow, exactly like it did in 1996. Calvin Joyner walks into this 148 hours removed from a parking garage gunfight with a bandaged arm under his jacket and a CIA case still being processed in federal paperwork somewhere. The reunion committee has no idea. The committee has a sign-in table and name tags and a photo booth in the corner, and they're running a slideshow of senior photos on the gym wall, and one of those senior photos is Calvin at 17, grinning that grin. He looks at it for a moment. Then he goes inside. Maggie is with him. She got the broad strokes of the preceding days. Not everything, not the classified everything, but enough to understand what her husband walked into and chose to stay inside of, and what that choice says about who he actually is when circumstances stop being ordinary. She squeezes his hand at the door and doesn't let go immediately, which is a small thing and not a small thing simultaneously. Dim fills up around them. Former classmates doing the reunion math, reading each other's name tags, cross-referencing present against memory, performing the specific social arithmetic of comparing current selves to who everyone used to be. Conversations start, drinks get poured, the slideshow loops, and then Bob Stone arrives. The room adjusts. Not dramatically. This isn't a movie moment with a spotlight and a record scratch. It's subtler, a few conversations slow, a few heads turn, a few name tags get squinted at because the name doesn't match the physical reality walking through the door. Bob is in a blazer. He found one somewhere, over the unicorn shirt, and the effect is genuinely difficult to describe. Extremely formal from the waist up, Bob Stone from the soul outward, radiating the same warm, slightly overwhelming presence he carries everywhere. He finds Calvin immediately. Of course he does. The look that passes between them in that reunion gymnasium is doing 20 years of work in about 3 seconds. Everything that happened, the bar, the numbers, the CIA, the detention room, the garage floor, and underneath all of it, the reason any of it was possible. 1996, a jacket, a kid who ran. Bob smiles. Calvin, who has been through one of the most operationally chaotic weeks of his adult life and has the arm bandage to prove it, smiles back. The speech is Bob's idea. The MC is running through the standard reunion programming, awards, callbacks to old superlatives, that kind of thing, when Bob Stone raises his hand and asks if he can say something. There's a beat of MC confusion. Bob is already at the microphone. What follows is one of the most quietly extraordinary sequences in the film. Bob Stone, standing in front of his entire graduating class, tells them who he is. Not what he does. He's not at liberty to discuss what he does, but who he is, where he came from, the name he was born with. He says Robbie Weirdicht out loud, clearly, into a microphone, in the gymnasium where that name was last spoken as a punchline during the worst 5 minutes of his teenage life. He doesn't frame it as tragedy, doesn't perform the wound for emotional credit. He just says it, straight, the way Bob says everything, with no filter between the thought and the air. The reclamation is in the doing of it. You understand this the moment it happens. The original humiliation derived its power from involuntary exposure. Robbie had no choice, no agency, no control over the moment that defined how his classmates saw him. What Bob does at the microphone inverts that entirely. He chooses the exposure, steps into it deliberately, on his terms, at a time and place of his own selection. The gymnasium can't hurt him with something he gives freely. Robbie Weirdicht got thrown into this room. Bob Stone walked in. That's the whole movie, actually. That's the theme the script has been building toward since a naked kid hit a gym floor in 1996 and one person threw a jacket. Transformation isn't about running from who you were. It's about getting to the point where who you were doesn't have power over you anymore, where the worst thing that happened to you becomes something you can say out loud in a room full of people and feel nothing from them but your own voice coming back. Trevor Olsen, predictably, chooses this moment to open his mouth. Moment is small, another one of those, technically, a joke things that Olsen has been deploying his entire adult life without consequence. The room laughs. Old habits. The social permission structure of a reunion full of people who remember who held the power in 1996 briefly reasserts itself. Bob Stone knocks him out. Cleanly, efficiently, without heat or drama, with approximately the same energy he used in the bar 3 days ago. Olsen goes down and the room goes very quiet, and Bob straightens his blazer and returns to the microphone as though a minor logistical matter has been resolved. The MC makes a sound that isn't quite a word. Nobody else makes a comment. Darla McGutcheon has been at this reunion all night. Bob has clocked her since approximately 12 seconds after walking through the door. Because of course he has. Because Bob Stone does not process any room without identifying the person who mattered most to him within it, and Darla has mattered to Bob since well before 1996. She's the old crush, the unfinished sentence, the person he thought about through years of transformation when he needed a reason to keep pushing. ENS. Their conversation is private. The film gives them the space to have it off screen, which is the correct call. What matters isn't the dialogue, it's the image of Bob Stone at his own 20-year reunion, approaching the person he cared about as himself. Not Robbie trying to prove something. Not Bob performing confidence he had to build piece by piece, just a man walking across a gymnasium floor without apology. That freedom, the specific freedom of no longer being afraid of your own history, is what every year of work was actually for. Maggie tells Calvin she's pregnant at the reunion. The timing is very Maggie. She picks the exact moment when Calvin is present enough to actually receive it, when the noise of the preceding week has settled enough that the information can land where it should. Calvin's reaction is the best thing Kevin Hart does in the entire film, and what he does is nothing fancy. He just goes completely still and then completely not still, and the two of them are in their own world briefly in the middle of a gymnasium full of people who don't know any of what just happened to them this week. Future! After everything! A reason to come home that Calvin didn't know about when he made the choice to come home. The movie knew what it was doing when it saved this for here. The CIA comes through. Bob's case. The financial records Calvin built, the operational evidence from the garage, the confirmation of Stanton's involvement and the collapse of the Black Badger's cover, processes through the agency, the way institutional machinery eventually processes things that are undeniable, slowly, and then all at once. Bob's name gets cleared. The record gets corrected. Harris, to her credit, advocates for the correction with the same methodical persistence she brought to the original case. She was wrong before. She corrects it with the same professionalism. Calvin gets offered a position, not a front desk position, not a consultant arrangement, a real operational role, working alongside Bob, the specific combination of financial forensics and field support that the preceding 72 hours demonstrated is both possible and apparently quite effective. He says yes. Maggie's face when he tells her contains several layers of emotion running simultaneously. Pride, terror, the particular expression of a woman recalculating her marriage with new and extremely unexpected variables. She processes it the way Maggie processes everything, completely, without shortcuts, arriving at acceptance through the honest work of actually sitting with the thing rather than reacting to it. She tells him, "Don't get shot," he tells her, working on it. The varsity jacket comes back. Bob gives it to Calvin at the end of the night. The original, impossibly preserved or replaced, returned across 20 years with the same directness and lack of ceremony that characterized its original giving. No speech, no dramatic presentation. He just holds it out. Calvin takes it. That's the whole film in a gesture. Everything the script has traveled through, the humiliation, the transformation, the Facebook notification, the satellite codes, the parking garage, the gunfight, the reunion speech, the knocked-out bully, the pregnancy, the yes to a new chapter, all of it circles back to a gymnasium, a jacket changing hands, a choice to be decent when decency costs something. jacket was always going to come back. So what does Central Intelligence actually get right? Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart together is the honest answer. Not Johnson alone. His physical transformation from Robbie to Bob requires a comedic partner to properly register, someone to calibrate the absurdity against, not Hart alone. Calvin's arc needs the disruption that only Bob Stone can provide. Together, they create a dynamic that the film's script supports, but the two of them frankly exceed. The chemistry is real, and you can feel it in every scene they share. The specific comfort of two performers who trust each other, enough to leave space, to not fill every beat with performance, to let moments breathe. The 1996 opener is the film's genuine achievement. It earns everything that follows. A 5-minute cold open that establishes a relationship, a wound, a theme, and an emotional contract with the audience, all before a title card. That's craft, regardless of everything else. Where the film is less sure of itself, the middle section occasionally treats the spy plot mechanics as more important than the relationship plot driving it. Some of the action logistics get technical in ways that slow the specific human story the movie is actually telling. The villain architecture works, but Aaron Paul Stanton could have been given another scene, one more beat to make the betrayal hit the weight it's trying to hit, and the tonal wobble between genuine emotional depth and broad physical comedy is real, not always successfully navigated. There are moments where the film can't quite decide whether it wants to be a warm character study or a popcorn action comedy, and it tries to be both simultaneously and lands somewhere slightly between, which occasionally costs it the full impact of its own better ideas. But here's what stays. The thing I keep coming back to every time I watch this movie is the simplicity of its central argument. It isn't making a complicated case. It isn't asking you to sit with moral ambiguity or challenge your assumptions or reframe your understanding of genre. It's saying one person showing up for another person, genuinely, without calculation, at personal cost, is enough. Not enough to fix everything, not enough to remove the wound or undo the damage or guarantee that the world becomes fair, but enough to matter, enough to be the thing someone carries forward, enough to be the reason they became someone worth knowing. Calvin Joyner threw a jacket. Bob Stone built a life. That's it. That's all of it. The satellite codes and the CIA and the parking garage and Trevor Olson going down in a gym were always just the vehicle for that. The movie knows it, the best moments know it, and in those moments, the opener, the therapy session, the look across the detention facility, the reunion speech, the jacket returning, Central Intelligence is doing something genuinely true about how much an ordinary act of decency can mean to someone who had nothing else to hold on to. That's the movie, and it earns it.